Hello and welcome to today's program, hosted by the Center for Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. I'm your host, Naeem Mahmood. And it is my privilege to introduce our guest, Professor Alan Mikhail, a distinguished historian from Yale University. Professor Alan specializes in the history of the Middle East, the early modern Muslim world, the Ottoman Empire, Egypt, environmental history, and the history of medicine and early modern history. He has authored 5 influential books, including The Animal in Ottoman Egypt, Nature and Empire in Ottoman Egypt, and Environmental History, Under the Osman's Tree, The Ottoman Empire, Egypt, and Environmental History, God's Shadow, Sultan Selim, His Ottoman Empire, and the Making of the Modern World, and his most recent work, My Egypt Archive. Among these, God's Shadow received widespread acclaim, winning the gold medal in world history from the Independent Publisher Book Awards, being a finalist for the Connecticut Book Award, and earning a place on the long list of the Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence. It was also named a Book of the Year by Time Literary Supplement, History Today, Publishers Weekly, and Glamour. Professor Alan's groundbreaking work has been instrumental in establishing the field of Middle East environmental history, centering the Ottoman Empire in the global early modern history, and critically examining how archives shape our understanding of the past and present. Currently, he is exploring the intertwined history of Islam and colonial America. We are honored to have him with us today to share his insights and expertise on the Ottoman Empire in general and the reign of Sultan Selim in particular. So, Professor Alan, thank you and welcome to tonight's program.
Thank you very much. Nice to be with you.
So let's start with the first question. What inspired you to write about Sultan Selim and the Ottoman Empire's role in shaping the modern world we're living in?
Yeah, I mean, I could answer that question in a couple different ways. The first is to say that the Ottoman Empire is one of the major powers of the early modern world, and I think its history hasn't been treated sufficiently. So one of the goals of the book is to help historians and lay readers alike to really understand the empire in all of its importance for the early modern world. To do that, I center it on this major moment, I think the most important moment in Ottoman history, Sultan Selim's conquests of the Mamluk Empire in 1516 and 1517. I'm sure we'll talk more about this, but this really changes the empire for the rest of its history for the next 400 years until its end in the early 20th century. Another way to answer this question is to say that I am, in the first instance, a historian of the Arab world under Ottoman rule, specifically Egypt, as you mentioned in the book titles. And that period of history really begins, again, with this moment in 1516, 1517. So to better understand the history of the Ottoman Empire in the Arab world and the history of the Arab world under Ottoman rule, understanding this moment, this beginning moment during the reign of Selim is really important. So that also drew me to this topic.
So that begs the question, Alan, how does Sultan Selim differ from other famous Ottoman sultans, such as Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent? So in terms of legacy, in terms of leadership?
Yeah, so as I mentioned already, I think this conquest in 1516, 1517 is the most important moment in Ottoman history. And therefore, Sultan Selim is one of the most important sultans in Ottoman history. You know, the competition between who is the most important sultan is in some ways a little silly, but also an important question to ask. I think it's not necessarily the person as such, but the kind of events around which the events that shape that person's period, right? So why do I say 1516, 1517 is the most important moment in Ottoman history? This is when the empire moves from being an empire mostly of the Balkans and Western Anatolia to being an empire that is all of Anatolia into parts of what is today Iran, all of the Arab world, into North Africa, down the Arabian Peninsula. It changes the shape of the empire for the next 400 years. So for 2/3 of its history, it gives the empire a different character, makes it much more of an Islamic empire. We might even say an Arab empire. It puts it into a completely different geography, giving it control of the entirety of the Eastern Mediterranean, putting it into the Indian Ocean world through the Red Sea, putting it against Iran in the east, across North Africa, eventually to the borders of Morocco. It takes a few decades for the empire to fully incorporate those territories, but nevertheless, and makes it, we might argue, the most important Muslim empire of the period, right? As holders of some of the major cities of the Muslim world, Istanbul, of course, Damascus, Cairo, the Hijaz, importantly, for religious reasons, makes them the sponsors of the annual pilgrimage, gives the empire a completely different character. It also puts the empire on the agenda of other states. It had been before, of course, especially after 1453, but this really makes them rivals for one of the most important empires in the period. We might think of the Spanish alongside them in the Mediterranean, potentially the Venetians, but they're much more sprawling than the Ottomans are as a land-based empire. So in any case, this is the moment in which European capitals are very concerned about the Ottomans, and you see this in all the source material produced in this period. You asked specifically about Suleiman, Selim's son. I would say that one of the reasons Suleiman is so well known in the West and across the world is precisely because of the territorial conquests that his father, Selim, succeeded in achieving. It's precisely because the Ottomans are such a major world power, thanks to Selim's conquests, that people are interested in the empire during Suleiman's reign. Selim only rules for 8 years, from 1512 to 1520, so a very short period of time. Suleiman rules for 46 years, the longest reigning sultan in Ottoman history, and is important for all kinds of reasons having to do with art, the kind of perfection of the bureaucracy, if you like, and many other factors. Militarily, he advances a little bit in Iraq and a little bit in Hungary, but not, enormous conquests. The kind of diplomatic arrangements that the Ottomans are undertaking during Suleiman's reign are really a product of Selim's conquest. So 1516, 1517 changes the empire more than any other single moment in its history, I argue in the book. And that's why I think Selim is, if not the most important sultan, but one of the most important sultans.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned very clearly in the book that Selim always kept on pushing the boundary of the empire, isn't it? I mean, shortly after becoming the sultan, he started fighting with the Safavids, right? And then later on, he fought with the Mamluks as well. And in doing so, he conquered the Syria and then Egypt, and then of course he pushed his ran to the Makkah and Medina as well, and of course the holy site of Jerusalem too. So do you consider him as one of the expansionist sultan in the history of the Ottoman?
Yeah, I mean, intention versus result are two different things, right? But the result is certainly, it is certainly the case that he expands the empire more than any other sultan, just in terms of sheer territorial increase. Selim increases it more than any other sultan. Did he set out to do that from the beginning of his reign or not? I think that's harder. That's harder to determine. But you are right that almost for the entirety of his 8 years, he's not in Istanbul, but is out on campaign. right, against the Safavids in 1514, and then the Mamluk campaigns after that. He's only in Istanbul for a very short period of time.
Yeah, one interesting question and thing that I've noticed that he kept on pushing on the east, not to the west.
Mm-hmm.
For example, the European side. Alan, any idea why he chose to push on this side?
Yeah, well, I mean, there are a couple of ways to answer that question. One is a question perhaps of opportunity, right? The opportunities for expansion were more open in the east than they were in the west in this period. Another way that I spend a great deal of time going into in the book is the fact that he was posted as governor to the city of Trabzon in the far east of Anatolia on the Black Sea. And during his governorship, he spends more time in Trabzon than he does anywhere else in his life. He lives for 50 years. And it is there in Trabzon that he first comes into contact with some of the tribal groups that will come to be a part of the Safavid world, and comes to understand the Ottoman Empire. I want to say as a frontier empire, but understands that there are enemies on the other side of the border, if you like. He leads a campaign into the Caucasus, into Georgia, during his reign as governor. But it's there that he really comes to understand the empire as having this military expansionist both history and potential, and he uses this rhetorically in his battle against his half brothers for the throne. But it's certainly there that he comes into contact both with the Eastern powers and also makes important contacts in the Ottoman military that will serve him both in taking the throne and then later in his expansion against the Safavids and the Mamluks.
Yeah, interesting. You see, there were at the similar time frame, there were some kind of developments going on the European side as well, right? You mentioned about Columbus was trying to reach to the America, and of course that was part of his, as you mentioned, the part of his own style of crusade. He wanted to pursue sort of thing. So in this process, I mean, the Ottoman Empire played a pivotal role in shaping the modern world, as you've argued in the book. So could you please elaborate a bit further how these two sides, collided and how they went ahead?
Yes, I use Columbus kind of as an example of a wider phenomenon, right? So Columbus is born 2 years before 1453, before the Ottomans take Constantinople, which is a huge sort of moral, religious, eschatological injury for Christian powers in Europe, right? As one of the popes says, it's plucking out one of the eyes of Christendom. So Columbus is raised in a world in which there's creeping Ottoman power from east to west in the Mediterranean world. He's born in Genoa, where there are many crusaders leave from Genoa. Genoa has important trading posts in the eastern Black Sea, a few in the eastern Mediterranean, but mostly in the eastern Black Sea. Those are steadily retreating thanks to Ottoman advances. So he's very much raised in a world in which Christendom is seemingly losing to Muslim advances, if you like, but specifically the Ottomans. As a teenager, he is an apprentice soldier, and as part of the voyages that he's working on, abuts various parts of the Muslim world, North Africa, and then in the Aegean. And I go through this in the book. And so he's very much raised in a world in which, because of Christian losses to the Muslim world, some sort of dramatic move to turn back this tide is needed. And he very much undertakes this kind of crusader mindset, and he uses the language of crusade to push his project for an alternative route to Asia with Ferdinand and Isabella, the Spanish sovereigns. And they very much are part of this notion of crusade as well. What's going on in Spain in this period is a very complex story. I go into it in the book, but essentially the Catholic monarchs are moving against the Muslims in southern Spain, right? So 1492 is not only the Atlantic voyages, it is also the Reconquista, right? The reconquering of the Muslim South by Ferdinand and Isabella. And it's also, of course, the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. All of these things go together in the minds of the Spanish sovereigns, and all of them are part of what they see as a global crusade of Christendom against its perceived enemies. So Columbus is a part of that story, and so the Ottoman component of this is obviously 1453, their advances west in the Mediterranean, but also as one of the most important Muslim states around the Mediterranean. The Mamluks are still in power in the south, of course, but the Ottomans are in power in Anatolia and the Balkans. They're perceived as taking territory away from Christian powers, right? Of having, at this point, a majority Christian subject population, the Ottomans do. Even as Muslim sovereigns, the majority of the people who live in the empire are Christians. There are rumors that the Ottomans are sending reinforcements to the Muslims in the south who are battling against Spanish forces. There are this notion that there's an Ottoman fifth column in Spain is one that is drummed up by Spanish politicians. So in all of these ways, Ottoman-Spanish rivalry very much comes to shape the worldview in which Columbus is born and of his youth. And so in these ways, understanding what produced Columbus as a kind of crusader, in part is an Ottoman story, and is much more so a story of the kind of confrontation between Islam and Christendom in the Mediterranean world. Now, once Columbus crosses the Atlantic, and of course he is again symbolic of this generation of conquistadors, understands some of what he sees in what he perceives to be Asia, right? He believes he has found a part of Asia. Until the day he dies, he believes that. He uses his old world experiences of Islam as a kind of filter to understand what he's seeing in what he, again, perceives to be Asia. So he describes, for instance, the clothing that Taino women in the Caribbean are wearing as, quote, Moorish sashes, right? He uses the language of Islam to try to understand something of the new world of the Caribbean that he's encountering. So these are, I think, very important kind of connective threads across the Atlantic. The kind of narrative of rupture that 1492 is often thought to embody, I think, does a disservice to understanding it actually as a story of continuity between what comes before 1492 and what comes after.
Excellent. I would like to delve into the issue of slavery, Alan. You addressed this part at the very beginning of the book, to be honest with you, and that was a bit of fascinating because given the fact that slavery was dealt with differently in Ottoman Empire in one way and the European side on the other way, given the fact that the lot of Ottoman Sultanate's wife were basically from slave, taken from the European part of that. So could you shed some light on your thoughts on that? I mean, how this slavery was dealt with in both sides and give us a bit of idea on the situation on that part.
Sure. Right. Hugely complex topic that we won't be able to do justice to. You're right. Just to put a fine point on this, slavery is a global phenomenon that exists in nearly all cultures, let's say, and has existed from antiquity, we might say through the present in various forms. So the kind of contrast I draw in the book is between a kind of Ottoman or Muslim form of enslavement and what comes to be the transatlantic slave trade. So you're right that in the Ottoman world, slavery existed, a very common institution, various forms of slavery. The Mamluks themselves, right? The term Mamluk literally means owned. So there's a military form of slavery in which usually Christian boys who are captured during conquest of a territory are brought to a Muslim capital or a major city, and entered into the military services forcefully, right? They're made soldiers.
The
captive
Janissaries, you
in-
mean?
The Janissaries and the Mamluks, this exists in multiple Muslim polities. It's not just an Ottoman phenomenon. You can see similar things in Iran and in South Asia as well. But so these boys are brought into the military classes. They're given a military education, and some can rise through the ranks.
Yeah.
Some even become the leaders of the states, right? So the Mamluk sultans, many of them had their origins as enslaved boys who were forcibly entered into military service. Another form of slavery in the empire that you mentioned is the harem, right? So these are enslaved women, again, forcibly separated from their homes and their families, brought to Istanbul. They don't have rights. They are kept in the harem. They don't have rights over their body or their sexuality. And the system of creating Ottoman sultans from the relationships between sultans and concubines is a very complicated one that the historian Leslie Pierce has studied better than anybody. But essentially, to make a very long story short, every Ottoman sultan is the son of an enslaved concubine woman and an imperial father, right? So we can talk about the relative attributes of a system of slavery such as that. It is different than, say, a world like the American South in the 19th century and earlier, in which enslaved peoples are used in agricultural labor. That's something that you don't see very often at all in the Ottoman world. There's some indications of that, but not really. Slavery in the Ottoman world is racialized, right? We have black slaves that are brought to the Ottoman Empire from parts of Africa, Sudan especially. And you have a kind of white slavery of especially around the harem of women from around the Black Sea, the Caucasus, Romania, other parts of that area around the Black Sea. The transatlantic slave trade is a very different story that happens somewhat contemporaneously to the Ottoman story, but the story of Muslim enslavement, it goes back much further and goes ahead in time also. As it's relevant for the story that I tell in the book, it's very clear that to the Spanish initially, right, and this will be true of other European powers in the Americas, that to run plantations, they need forced labor, enslaved labor. This is both amongst Native American, the indigenous peoples of the Americas, and then increasingly enslaved Africans that are brought specifically for that purpose. In the very early period, either because of flight or death from disease and warfare, there's a lack of labor in the Americas for the Spanish. And very early on, already in the second or third decade after 1492, enslaved West Africans are brought to places like Hispaniola. Now, given the conversation we just had about Columbus and Islam and Christendom and crusading, etc., the Spanish sovereigns are very wary of bringing Muslims to places like Hispaniola. They want to ensure that their enslaved West African population is either nominally Christian, right, have converted either before 1492 or after, and some are actually brought to Iberia, sort of held in a kind of Christian quarantine for a few years and then shipped once we can be confident about their Christianity. Others are non-Christians, but also non-Muslims. And so throughout this the first 30, 40 years of colonization in the Caribbean, you see these kinds of conversations. Plantation owners in the Americas saying, we really need labor, send more West Africans, and Spanish sovereigns saying, okay, we understand, but we want to make sure that we're not sending enslaved Muslims to the Americas. So that's a very interesting aspect of this history that's not often acknowledged, right? And there are instances in which those running plantations will say, there's evidence that our enslaved West Africans are, quote, infecting native peoples with the bad customs of Islam, right? So again, this anxiety about importing Islam to a place in which Islam didn't exist, right, is a very live one for Europeans.
Interesting. So far, I understood that Islam was introduced in Americas through the slavery, actually. So that is a kind of part coming up in recent studies. So we're going back to the story of the Columbus. Actually, we are talking about that and connecting this story of Columbus and slavery and a lot of contemporary issues. You try to piece up a lot of things together. So what kind of challenges you had in building them all together, piecing together all these narratives? Do you really faced any particular issues, any particular challenges?
Sure. I mean, in any historical study, there are multiple challenges. What is simply source material, right? What are the sources that you have to be able to tell these stories? On the Ottoman side, it's a bit early for court records, for example, which are a very important part of Ottoman history. We have largely hagiographical accounts about Selim, the Selim Name, which mostly are written after his life. We have various chronicles written at the time of Selim's life and during his reign. And then we have kind of historians who have written, but I'm speaking about Ottoman historians in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries who have written about the history of the empire. So you have that set of sources. The major innovation of my book, I think, is to bring together sources that are not generally brought together. So there's the Ottoman corpus, of course, which is very well known, but bringing that together with the Spanish sources about Columbus and the Ottoman-Spanish rivalry in the Mediterranean. I'm interested in the book in Luther. I have a chapter on Martin Luther. So his writings on Islam, the Turks, etc. Various accounts by European sovereigns, various popes about the Ottomans, and sometimes specifically about Selim. There are sources from the Americas. So Columbus's accounts, Cortez's letters, other of the early sources on the Americas. I look at John Smith's accounts from Virginia from a later period for reasons I could get into if you like. So I want to read widely, right? If one of the goals of the book is to understand a kind of global history of the Ottomans in this period, I need to read globally. And so that's what I try to do in the book. And that's the kind of major challenge in terms of source material in the book. There's a kind of second challenge, which is one of, we might say, imagination, worldview, historical understanding, overcoming of staid, traditional, sometimes biased historical accounts about the place of the Ottomans, of Islam, etc. So a lot of the work in the book is trying to overcome that. And that is really a project of historical narration and imagination. And I try to embody in the book what it might look like to tell a much larger story of the Ottomans in the world, or of Islam in the world in this period. And that argues against some of the major traditional accounts we have of the Ottomans for sure, but also, the making of the modern world, as the subtitle says. And so that has to do with canonical accounts about the Atlantic voyages. We've already kind of discussed that a little bit, about the rise of various confessions in this period, whether it's Protestantism or Shiism and their attachment to various states, right? In Germany, in the German lands, in Iran, the Ottomans and Sunniism, for example, Catholicism and the Spanish sovereigns. So these are all, this book is trying to overturn many of the narratives that we have. And so that requires a different way of telling the story.
Definitely. In piecing these stories together from so many sources, Alan, you seem to have challenged the Eurocentric narrative of the world history. I mean, because the way we know the modern history is written up in where we've seen the contribution of the Muslims or other civilizations who are not that much predominant, not that much given place, especially when we know that European Enlightenment had inherited a lot from the contemporary civilizations, especially from the Middle Eastern and other parts. So you definitely face challenges in encountering Eurocentric narrative in writing these books. So how did you deal with that? What made you do that?
Yeah. So I'll say a couple of things. I mean, one is, as you say, so many of the stories that we have about the creation of the modern world, that clunky phrase, are stories of the rise of Europe, essentially, or of a kind of global trade, a kind of amorphous, seamless, almost, neoliberal, avant-garde form of global trade. Islam as a kind of world power, civilization, force, set of states, important phenomenon, is largely left out of that, right? And I think, I go back to 1492. One of the reasons I want to connect those threads of Islam across the Atlantic is precisely because, much as the Spanish sovereigns did in trying to keep Islam out of the Americas, 1492 cuts off Islam from any kind of story of the Americas, right? And the Americas are so much a part of the rise of Europe and of the making of the modern world, that by understanding that there is a Muslim component to this story, it's perhaps not the most important. It is not determinative of everything. We might even say it's minor, but it is important, and it is an important indication of the place of the Muslim world in world history before and after 1492, right? So telling the stories of Islam in the kind of large world-changing events that happened in the reign of Selim or in the life of Selim are one of the ways that I try to overcome a solely Eurocentric narrative. So understanding a kind of the Muslim character of 1492, understanding the place of Islam in the thinking of Martin Luther. Again, not the most important aspect of Martin Luther's thought, but important nevertheless. And there, understanding the state rivalries around the Mediterranean between Christian and Muslim polities. These are major, forces in world history that historians know about. But it's not in the imagination of most people when they think about how we go from say 1500 to now. And so part of the work of that book is just to kind of move the camera a little bit so that people can get a slightly different view and a slightly more complicated view of how we get here, right? So that is overall the kind of major goal of the book.
Right. Going back to the Selim again, I mean, how much religion and ideology shaped his vision for Ottoman Empire, you think? I mean, Did he see himself as a religious figure, a warrior? I mean, religious warrior? What kind of person he was in terms of religion and setting up his vision?
Yeah. Again, great questions and somewhat difficult questions to answer, right? On the kind of intention versus what actually plays out on the ground. So, I'll answer it this way. When he moves against the Safavids, right, who are increasingly connecting their state ideology and polemic to Shiism. He very much takes on a kind of Sunni character, both as a warrior and we might argue for the Ottoman Empire itself, right? So this plays out in various ways, right? So there's the kind of a disparaging of Shiism that you see in some of his writings, right? Of using very derogatory language about Shiism. And, more to the point, he undertakes a massive massacre of 40,000 of his own Shiite subjects as part of that campaign against the Safavids. This is a massacre that, until the end of the 19th century, stands as one of the largest domestic killing of Ottoman subjects. So, one can read religion into that, certainly. Is that religion as belief or religion as politics? I think unclear, but clearly plays a role. The other way in which I think religion is important here is a different conquest, so 1516, 1517, with the taking of the Arab world and of the Hejaz and Mecca and Medina and Jerusalem, as you rightly added. This is the moment in which the kind of Muslim character of the empire begins, right? This is the moment in which the Ottomans now are the guardians of the holy cities of Islam, in which the population of the empire, I said before, up until that point, the vast majority of the people who live in the empire are Christians. That changes after 1516, 1517, right? So a much more Islamic character to the empire in terms of its subject population, in terms of the ideology of the state, in terms of the increasing language of the caliphate after this period. So in all of these ways, I think we can read religion and ideology together.
So going back to that point you mentioned, that killing of the 40,000 Shiite sect people, how much politics played into that? Do you think it was more about politics than religion? Because as we can understand that the Shiite sect at the time under the Ismail, the leader, were posing a bit of threat to his dominion at the time.
Well, certainly Selim thought that. Certainly he thought that as Shiites, they pledged allegiance to Ismail. The historical record is not at all clear on that, and that is probably more rhetorical than anything, right? That's a very nice justification. In the same way, we might argue that the Spanish sovereigns said that the Muslims in the south were pledging allegiance to the Ottomans.
Yeah.
The historical record on that is very wishy-washy, if not outright clear, that they did not pledge allegiance either to Ismail or to the Ottomans in the case of the Spanish. So I think that is a pretext that is used by Selim for this, to justify this massacre. There's no evidence that they were taking up arms against Selim's armies, for example, right?
Right. So when he was expanding his empire, of course, this has influenced a lot in the global trade networks and regional powers and hegemonies. So how much actually he influenced his expansion influenced the global trade at the time?
Yeah. Again, he's only on the throne for 8 years, right? So the first thing to say is that I think, when we hear that Columbus and others were searching for a Western route to Asia to access trade routes, that is because of Muslim power in the Middle East, in the Eastern and Southern Mediterranean. That's a point that I think is often not acknowledged, right? It's because of a monopoly of trade in the middle that people are looking for trade routes around Muslim power, right? So Selim's conquests and unifying a place like Egypt, other parts of North Africa, what's conventionally termed the Middle East today, and the Balkans, Istanbul, Anatolia. I mean, that creates a kind of monopoly between the Mediterranean world and the Indian Ocean world in terms of trade routes, movement of peoples, etc. So the Ottomans benefit increasingly from that monopolization of trade. At the same time, though, this is a period in which Vasco da Gama has rounded Africa, and increasingly the Atlantic world comes to be open to trade. So both things are happening at the same time, right? On balance, the pluses and minuses of the kind of Vasco da Gama Columbus story and the Ottomans taking control of these trade routes, it's not at all clear, right? The Ottomans do not become a major global economic power. They're very wealthy. The trade between, for example, some of the Italian states with the East run through the Ottoman Empire, and Ottoman traders increasingly are trading with the East, especially once movement through the Red Sea is established. But the Ottomans don't become a huge global economic power, say in the 17th and the 18th centuries. They are very, very important, but they're not, I don't know, top 2 or 3, something like that.
Right. So going back to the Ottoman history in general, what is the most overlooked or misunderstood aspect of Ottoman history, you think, and how you think your book addressed that?
I mean, there are many. For an audience outside of Ottoman history, right? I think it's some of the things we've been discussing. Just the sheer centrality of the Ottomans, especially around this moment of 1516, 1517, for understanding world history in this period, right? That's a major takeaway from the book. For Ottoman historians, a kind of domestic audience, if you like, I think there's also a lack of understanding, a missed opportunity, or kind of willful non-recognition of 1516, 1517 as a foundational moment for the empire. I think some of that has to do with various nationalisms within the former Ottoman world, Turkish and Arab and others, that don't want to see the Arab world as integral to the Ottoman Empire, as central to it in so many ways. Going back to what I mentioned at the beginning of 1516, 1517 is kind of foundational for understanding that history. So within various kinds of Turkish nationalist historiographies of the Ottoman Empire, whether they're Republican or Islamist or something else. Again, this is a very large statement that is not true across the board, but there's a large body of work that is interested in understanding Ottoman history as the prehistory of Turkey, right? Ottoman history is partly that, but it's not exclusively that, right? So what would it look like to integrate the Arab world, again, from this 1516, 1517 moment into, more centrally into the story of Ottoman history? Many Ottoman historians do this, of course, but it is not given, I think, the weight that it needs and deserves. On the other side of the ledger, in various Arab countries, historians there don't think of the Ottomans as integral to their own histories. Right? They see the Ottomans as foreign colonial power, the British in India, right? Rapacious, stole our resources, just raped and pillaged, basically, for 300 years. And so really, to understand the history of Egypt or Syria or Palestine, it's a story despite the Ottomans, right? Not because of the Ottomans. And again, many historians don't do what I just described and are much more sophisticated in their work. But again, painting in very broad brushstrokes, that is still the case largely. This plays out in terms of the languages people learn, where they do their archival research, the issues they're interested in. So these are to answer your question about things that are not known about Ottoman historians. There's the kind of global audience, and then there's the kind of domestic audience of Ottoman historians. And so I hope the book plays a small role in trying to at least interject some doubt in various of those audiences.
Right. And my last question to you, Alan. What do you hope the readers take away from the God's Shadow?
A greater appreciation for the place of Ottoman history and Muslim history in understanding Europe, the Americas, and how our modern world came to be.
Right. So with that, we are ending our program today. We thank Professor Alan Mikhail for joining us, and we hope to see him again, Alan, in another interview. So until then, goodbye. Thank you, Alan, for joining us.
Thank you.